Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Goldman. I'm a professor at Santa Clara University School of Law in the Silicon Valley. I'm also a founding board member of the Trust and Safety Professional Association, which is an association of content moderation professionals. And I'm really grateful for you joining me today for this video. I'm also grateful for the organizers for scheduling this video. I really appreciate the opportunity to present my project to you. And this is a draft project, so it's still receptive to your comments. And I'm hoping that you'll send me your thoughts and your suggestions in response to this video. That's one of the reasons I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present it. I will admit that this talk will be a little bit US-centric, and so I know that the rules might be different in other parts of the world. I think that the concepts I'm talking about are going to be applicable across the globe, but I do want to acknowledge for those of you watching it who are not from the US that I am putting my finger on that scale a little bit. So the title of my talk is Validating Transparency Reports, or I've also called it Enforcing Transparency Reports. And it obviously addresses transparency reports, something that have been a staple of RightsCon forever. When I talk about transparency, I'm actually interested in a couple of different categories of things that might be covered by a transparency report. That includes data about content moderation operations, but also even data about or disclosures about content moderation operations or content moderation algorithms, anything about what's going on under the hood of the company while they're doing content moderation. To me, any transparency requirements are going to be subject to the discussion that I have here. So when I look at the transparency report literature, there's a lot of discussion about the value of it, and in particular about what things need to be disclosed. And I think that's great. But I want to talk about a different angle of transparency reports. For me, I think the interesting question is, how do we know that whatever is disclosed is true? And that might strike you as an odd statement, but let me make my case to you why I'm going to start from the position that what we get in these transparency reports might not be true. In fact, it might often not be true. And now we have to figure out what we're going to do about that. Okay, why wouldn't companies tell the truth in their transparency reports? We would start with the premise, of course they would tell the truth in it. And so let me give you some ideas about reasons why. One is that the disclosures might be embarrassing to them. It might expose them to public ridicule or scrutiny. They may be concerned that the disclosures are going to disclose trade secrets, or that they're going to provide some competitive advantage to their competitors, or that it's going to help the malefactors game the system somehow. They may be concerned about how the disclosures conflict with whatever public narrative they're trying to say. They're trying to tell one story in Congress or in other legislatures, another story in the press, and then the transparency report tells a different and conflicting story. They may not want that. It might expose legal violations. If they disclose what they're doing, it might might confirm or provide evidence that they're violating the law somehow. Disclosures might reflect judgment calls that are debatable, and they might not want to have a debate about those judgment calls. Things, very simple things like, how do you count the number of items that are hate speech? That's a judgment call, and those judgment calls then might be exposed in a way that they don't want to address publicly. And then finally, the disclosures might not be a lie intentionally, but they might just be the product of sloppy data collection practices, that they don't invest enough to generate accurate results. They cut corners in the process. And so let me start with the challenge to everyone who's excited about transparency reports, that there's really good reasons why those transparency reports might not be telling the truth. And in fact, because of the financial and political stakes associated with the information transparency reports, there's actually a pretty good incentive for companies to not tell the truth intentionally as part of creating a narrative for their public relations, or as part of what is functionally propaganda. Now, if there's a rigorous enforcement mechanism, then of course they'll be more likely to tell the truth. And so a lot of the questions I have about transparency reports shifts from the what of transparency reports to who's actually going to make sure that they're true. How effective is that mechanism? And if that mechanism isn't effective, then all those reasons I just gave you, that transparency reports might be inaccurate, then become more cogent. We might start to worry about the legitimacy of the information. So this takes me to the conundrum that I've been wrestling with, and this is where I really am excited to hear from you. your thoughts. So the most obvious way that we can hold companies accountable for transparency reports is through litigation. We can have government sue them, or we can have private plaintiffs or civil society sue them. That's what we do, right? If companies tell lies, we sue them. And yet, here's some problems with that, or the things that have given me pause. First of all, how will anyone who receives those transparency reports know that there's something amiss? We just kind of take it on faith that they're trying to tell us the right story. But if we step back from that, then what evidence will we have to challenge those transparency reports? The companies have all the data, we don't. And so there's nothing that would signal that they might have cooked the books, that they might not be telling the full story. And so there's no tip-off to trigger that enforcement mechanism. And so, I don't even know how the question's gonna pose unless there's something so obviously missed, or unless we get a whistleblower. We won't know enough to actually challenge that information. The second concern I have is that how are the plaintiffs, the government or some private entity, going to be able to double check the data? What is it that they're going to do in discovery to try and validate the information that's in the report? And I get really nervous with the idea that the plaintiffs, the government or the private litigants, are going to go out and say, I'm going to double check if you accurately characterize this content moderation decision as being in this category. There's going to be a lot of judgment calls on each individual content item. And I get nervous with that idea. The government's going to say, you mischaracterized how that was. That sounds like an intrusion into the editorial practices and editorial freedom of the services to decide what content they want to publish. And here in the United States, we have limits on the ability of government regulators to go in and investigate editorial operations. This really runs squarely into the First Amendment for the obvious reasons that the government could misuse that power to try to control what actually gets published. And so the idea that the government's going to come and second guess the information that's in these transparency reports by double checking decisions strikes me as really problematic at its core. I also think there's problems with privacy, and having government or private litigants coming in looking through the source data to try and validate the information seems to put any privacy concerns in that information at risk. And of course, there's just a cost of doing this. There's a cost of enforcing the transparency reports through discovery. That's an expensive process for both sides. That's going to be a foreboding process for everyone. So the obvious alternative is that we could mandate that the transparency report be coupled with some kind of independent audit. We do this in other circumstances, like with financial statements. Those are routinely audited. And under US law, there's times when they must be audited. So we can certainly require that here as well, but those are also really costly. We can't require that of all people who we might want transparency reports from, and we might not even really want the cost to be incurred even for people who might have enough money to clear it. And also, notice that whoever's going to be that auditor is going to be subject to the influence of whoever's hiring them. They're the ones paying the bills. This is a known problem with financial statement auditing, for example. And there's been really good systems built to try and curb that. But the bottom line is that unless we build equivalently robust systems, then whoever's hired to audit it will have a lot of incentive to validate whether it's accurate or not, because that's who's paying the bills. So I want you to take two takeaway points from this lightning talk here. First is that if we aren't clear about how we're going to make sure that the information transparency reports are accurate, the transparency reports might actually be pointless, or they might even be pernicious. We might be mandating the production of information that's designed to ultimately mislead us from a policy standpoint. So as you're thinking about transparency reports, I want you to think about what mechanism is going to be in place to make sure that they're accurate. And here in the United States, I'm nervous that we won't be able to rely on the government as an enforcement mechanism because of the First Amendment limits on investigating editorial integrity. And as a result, it's possible that if the government can't enforce it, if there isn't a good third-party enforcer, and if we don't require audits, or if they're not effective, that transparency reports are kind of a policy dead end. We're actually not getting what we bargained for. And as a result, the information produced is ultimately useless or worse. So that's my talk. I beg you, please share with me your thoughts about this. Help me work through these conundrums. I appreciate you coming to my lightning talk, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.